I'd like to introduce our next participant presenter. He is Christian Reynolds. He's a doctoral candidate at the University of South Australia, and he'll be presenting his paper, which is entitled Diplomatic Gastronomy, the Convivial Nature of the Power of Prestige, Cultural Diplomacy, and Soft Power. Please join me in welcoming Christian Reynolds.
Give me a warning at 5 minutes and then...
Absolutely.
Thank you. Good morning. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Please forgive me for being so jet-lagged at the moment. I got on a plane yesterday in Australia and it's now about 7 a.m. there, so I apologise about that. And I'm going to be presenting a little bit of a cheeky paper today on an aspect of cultural diplomacy that usually goes a little bit under the radar, so to speak. And, well, as we've heard in this morning's discussions, Ambassadors Volovic, Stesler, Kamal, and of Professor Kosno, all discussed around this issue and talked about, well, Kofi Annan had a dinner party before talking about this, or that, as Ambassador Kamal said, will prefer to be outside in the lobby having coffee instead of inside at a round table discussion. So food is an ever-present part of dining, and there are two nice little quotes coming up there if you want to look. Torpedo saying, "In what we choose to eat, we express who we are and where we come from. Cross-culturally, food is an invaluable tool for communicating emotional messages." And Briat Savran, who is one of the great gastronomes and food philosophers of the 17th century, stated that the fate of nations has often been sealed at a banquet. And that's the idea I would like to run with today, ladies and gentlemen, the idea of food politics. Now, as we were saying, you've got to start with a little bit of a joke, so let's go with something Jacques Chirac said. You can't trust people who cook as badly as that. And he's talking about the English. After Finland, it's the country with the worst food. The only thing the British have given European agriculture and food is the mad cow. So quite a shocking statement he made back in 2005, and this was gobbled up, excuse the pun, by the European media, and it was the week before they voted on where was going to host the 2012 Olympics. France was one of them, England was the other, and suddenly there was a landslide towards England, causing a shift. And as we can, or if, well, anybody going to England or the UK in June, July is going to surely reap the rewards of long traffic queues and things like that while watching the Olympics. Anyway, so food is basically a very emotive issue. Food is an ever-present object in today's society, but it's also a common object that binds everybody together no matter what colour of our skin. We all have to eat every day. We have to consume food to sustain our lives, sustain ourselves, but because of this, we've actually created all these secondary meanings and symbolisms around it. However, since the end of the Cold War, food has generally been ignored in the political sphere along political studies. Palberg in the late 1980s did a bit on food agriculture and food aid as a form of hard power, but other than that it's been left well alone because it is such a slippery concept, like cultural diplomacy, like soft power and things like that. Anyway, so I'll be running with an idea that was presented by Morgenthau back in Politics Among Nations, in which he gave the idea of the power of prestige, and political prestige being a type of political power rather than the hard power that the realists often used. And this was a methodology for outside observers to actually engage with a method of seeing power in a contemporary setting. So using the power of prestige and prestigious acts as a barometer and also as a two-way mirror. So people within the diplomatic ceremony and within the prestige and diplomatic acts could actually view each other and see how each other responds, and also looking at it as a barometer, so to view how other people judge other people. So as a method of of instantaneous feedback, so to speak. If you could just slide again, please. So this is where I'm getting an idea of food coming from. So it's the power of prestige and the idea of diplomatic ceremony, and using the idea of diplomats as the actors around food. So an instantaneous way of saying that the diplomats and the people who actually are the means of governments, the actors and the elites, actually are using food and diplomatic ceremony such as banquets, dinners, brunches, those sorts of things, as methods to actually use power and to influence through cultural diplomacy and through soft power. So using a dinner and serving certain types of food will actually change the way people actually think about it, whether this be Japan serving a lot of sushi to maybe influence fishery policy and things like that, different things like that. So these are both non-military and non-force driven in their nature, but they are a way to change behaviours through perception, symbolism and culture. But as I was saying, they're not judged post hoc, they're a power event that can actually be judged on the fly, so to speak. where was I up to? If you go again. So the act of dining is usually used as a medium in which to enact the prestige and cultural diplomacy. So, as I was saying, most diplomats are these people. And we've just go one more because I just doubled up. So, diplomatic gastronomy. It falls into a couple of different categories, and the best one is probably the idea of a formal dinner. Formal dinners have been going on since the Treaty of Westphalia backwards, and they are the way to actually let a nation show off their culture. They're a way to impress, they're a way to dominate, they're a way to even make others kowtow to them in some of the Chinese banquets that have happened up to, say, the the Gunpowder Rebellions in China. With the act of formal dinners, there were a couple of different ways and things which are very symbolic. Who is, of course, present is very symbolic in the nature. The number of guests, if it's a very small private, if it's a formal, if it's informal. How the event is actually seated. Is it a round table like this? Is it a triangular table? It's down to the ideas of actual diplomacy and statecraft and the actual event organisation. Another thing, of course, is what is served and how much, and as I was saying, the level of formality. So these are a couple of things which have... there are a couple of things which actually go towards this. So I'll just go through a couple of these examples and then open the floor to some questions and just some ideas around this, because it's a form of cultural diplomacy that I feel has gone under the radar so far. So if we go to the first one, let's look at who. China was absent from a G8 dinner in 2008. This caused headlines around the world, and discussion was raised over it. On the 4th of July celebrations in 2009, Iran was invited by the US Embassy to come and share and have a hot dog and a hamburger. They turned this down. This again caused headlines around the world, and a nose was put out of joint. Some very interesting things happened in the 1960s, and there's a food scholar called Morgan, who's just published a thesis on the dinners of the Kennedy administration, in particular with Indian President Nehru and Pakistani President Khan. And there were some very interesting differences between the two formal dinners. So in Nehru's case, he came over and wished for simplicity with his dinners. He wanted a very lacking, a free, very symbolic, and actually turned the power dynamic of the entire visit on its head by asking for less stately decorum when dining with Kennedy. And so they had to reshuffle the entire meal plans around that. Khan, on the other hand, was greeted by Kennedy not in the White House but at Mount Vernon, and actually used that to symbolise to his own people his own status, not being greeted at the White House as a difference. The French, as we were saying, in 2008 with the BSE scare, and then of course the English in 2009 with the former Prime Minister's wife Sarah Brown being a vegan and not actually being able to eat some of the French traditional foods and refusing, causing a very big scare. What I've not actually listed up there is, of course, the former President Bush Sr. vomiting in the lap of the Japanese attaché after eating sushi in front of a huge crowd, and that again was a cultural gaffe and a change. Don't laugh, it happened. It's on YouTube. And of course, go and look it up, it's great. The really worrisome one, of course, the 18-course meal for the Poverty Summit in 2008, being a little bit of a disconnection between what diplomats felt was the right, appropriate amount of opulence and then what the general media and public thought was the right amount of opulence for a summit meal. So there's some of the who and the what. Anyway, if we continue going along. Then there, of course, the idea of seating and where people seat around a table. The headline, the G20 seating plans, never mind the stimulus package, who sat next to the president, is, of course, a idea with that one. And as I was saying, with the venue, President Khan dining in Mount Vernon as opposed to at the White House. So he was different from the Indian president at the time and where he dined. So there was actually a differentiation between the two of them there, all expressing a method of either serving food serving culture differently and interpreting culture differently through the medium of the dining experience. So finally, the lack of formality can also imply a closer diplomatic bonds with just people coming over or having a lighter dinner or having a dinner drinks party as opposed to a full sit-down meal, meaning that there's less to actually discuss in terms of pomp and circumstance. So if I'm just going to conclude there, after one more slide if you can. Concluding thoughts. The effective use of diplomatic gastronomy and of prestige as a form of cultural diplomacy is an interesting and hopefully thought-provoking for all of you avenue. So I've tried to go down a little bit more of a power-driven path and a cultural diplomatic path rather than going into, say, capitalist or other power plays. But what do you think about, can food, dinners and ceremony actually be a form of cultural diplomacy that is worthwhile and an avenue worth investigating? Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Reynolds.